In his book Apollo's Arrow, the Yale medical and social scientist Nicholas Christakis asks if, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we may find ourselves, like our great-grandparents and grandparents after the 1918-19 influenza pandemic, in the roaring 20s. The increased religiosity and reflection of the immediate and intermediate pandemic periods, he writes, could give way to increased expressions of risk-taking, intemperance, or joie de vivre in the post-pandemic period. The great appeal of cities will be apparent once again. People will relentlessly seek opportunities for social mixing on a larger scale in sporting events, concerts, and political rallies. And after a serious epidemic, Christakis goes on, people often feel not only a renewed sense of purpose, but a renewed sense of possibility. As he reminds us, the 1920s brought the widespread use of the radio, jazz, the Harlem Renaissance, and women's suffrage. This was at once the most quoted and least profound passage of his book. To say the least, it was a rather flattering sketch of the 1920s, a decade as notable in the United States for its violent criminals as for its flappers, and elsewhere mainly memorable for hyperinflation, hunger, Bolshevism, and fascism. The original allusion, incidentally, was to the roaring 40s, the powerful westerly winds well known to sailors that blow in the southern hemisphere around latitude 40 degrees. In any case, there are good reasons to doubt that the 2020s will be roaring in any sense at all, good or bad. Rather, the remainder of the decade may prove distinctly boring. Recurrent outbreaks and new variants, which will continue to turn up as long as a large share of the world's population remains unvaccinated or reliant on Chinese vaccines with low efficacy, may necessitate our getting regular booster shots of vaccine, perhaps more frequently than every year, may force us to keep those irksome masks in our pockets, may oblige us to keep filling in online forms to enable us to get into offices and onto planes. Equally boring will be the way countries revert to fighting their old battles the minute they bring COVID under control. A good example has been the resurfacing of Scottish independence as an issue, almost simultaneously with British COVID daily death numbers dropping into single digits. Already, in the same way, Europeans are returning to arguing about immigration, beginning in France. And in the United States, it hasn't taken long for Republican criticisms of a Democratic administration to mean revert. Deficits too high, taxes too high, illegal immigration too high, violent crime too high. Economists such as Larry Summers worry about rising, if not roaring, inflation because of the outsized US fiscal response relative to a modest output gap and rapid vaccine-driven recovery. However, in the absence of a major geopolitical shock, comparable with the prospect of defeat in Vietnam and the Arab-Israeli wars in the Middle East, both of which played a part in the inflation of the late 1960s and early 1970s, it's still not guaranteed that inflation will exceed, for more than a brief period, the Federal Reserve's target average of 2%. Perhaps, as happened in the wake of the financial crisis, easy money will merely cause asset bubbles, not consumer price inflation. Again, that could be pretty boring, unless you're running a hedge fund or decide to become a day trader. The 1920s are remembered by historians as a time when a first attempt at a liberal international order, the League of Nations, failed to take root, mainly because the Western European powers could not sustain without an American commitment the various peace treaties signed in and around Paris. The 2020s may be a little like that, though it's a global pandemic, not a war that the world's recovering from. Unlike its predecessor, the Biden administration believes in the liberal international order and the institutions and alliances that undergird it. At the same time, as Biden's campaign promised last year, his administration is in some ways being, or at least talking, tougher to China than its predecessor, broadening its criticisms of the Chinese Communist Party to include issues of democracy and human rights that never much interested Trump, and seeking to organize allies, notably Australia, India, and Japan, into something like a balancing coalition against China, an approach fundamentally different from Trump's indiscriminate protectionism. No meeting of the Trump era had more of a Cold War atmosphere than the new Secretary of State Antony Blinken's ill-tempered encounter with his Chinese opposite number, Yang Jiechi, at Anchorage in March. It's worth recollecting that in its early phase, Cold War I produced a distinctly hot war in Korea. That a similar confrontation might escalate over Taiwan is one of the more obvious risks of the post-pandemic period. On the other hand, it's also possible that an initial period of diplomatic hardball could be followed swiftly by détente, in which case our decade, especially if inflation does make a comeback, will start to feel more like the snoozing 70s than the roaring 20s. Perhaps the mistake Nicholas Christakis made was to think only of the 1920s. If we want to seek analogies for the post-pandemic period, why stop in the 20th century? In Stendhal's great novel of the ineffably boring 1820s, Le Rouge et le Noir, Julien Sorel embarks on a clerical career, realizing that it's his best hope of advancement in the France of the restored Bourbon monarchy. Sorel comes to a sticky end, less the victim of his philandering than of the rigid social hierarchy of the Restoration era. However, Stendhal is more forgiving of Sorel's impetuous nature than of the stifling dullness of Bourbon society. In case you hadn't noticed, the 2020s have not started off very excitingly for young people who have been confined to their homes, often to their parents' homes, obliged to engage in distance learning, denied a social life beyond the sad, squawking squares of Zoom, and essentially cut off from travel, and all for the sake of curbing the spread of a disease that posed a pretty small threat to young people's health. The evidence is accumulating of the adverse effects of lockdowns on the mental health of younger people. The economic consequences of the pandemic were also far from favourable to them. My suspicion is that the decade has fresh disappointments in store for the millennials and Generation Z. But the biggest disappointment of all will be if it turns out to be boring. For if my memory's not playing tricks on me, the hardest thing to endure when I was young seemed to be boredom. My mother constantly reminded my sister and me that we had no right to be bored. Unlike most children in the world, we had toys, games, and books aplenty. And yet boredom always seemed to be lurking in my teens and into my early 20s. Much of what we were made to read at school and university was excruciatingly boring. A wide range of unavoidable activities, lectures, church, train journeys, were nearly always boring. After all, we didn't have the distracting gadgets available to today's teenagers. All we had was the Beano or the New Musical Express. Small wonder that when punk rock came along to shatter the tedium of the snoozing 70s, one of its defining anthems was Bored Teenagers by the Adverts. There's nothing, in short, that says the 20s have to be roaring. They seem quite likely, after the upheavals of 2020, to be the boring 20s. For those of us in our 50s and older, this will come as a great relief, as we long ago learned how to cope with boredom, which is of course by being boring ourselves, reading old novels, weeding the garden, doing the crossword, going for walks, and enjoying every minute of it. It's the young I pity. We're just bored teenagers, sang the Adverts back in 1978. Looking for love, or should I say emotional rages. Yes, that brings back memories of a time when life seemed really, really boring. And all a teenager could do was, well, roar.